Hopefully that's all good. So, if you remember, we ended yesterday talking about India and how really, really obsessed and important India is to the British. China is a very, very interesting story. You and I will end this year talking about China as well. I think this is part of the world that you really need to know a lot about because China will affect your lives much more than it affected my life early on. What the Europeans have going on with China for a long period of time is triangular trade. Honestly, if you want to go way back, there were these things called the Silk Roads, and there were different products like silk, obviously, and porcelain, and textiles and so on that are coming from Asia, coming from China, going along the Silk Roads, getting to Europe, even in the Middle Ages. But what we have happening at this period of time in the 19th century is a kind of triangular trade that's going on with India and China and Europe. And once again, mostly what we're talking about here is Britain. Britain is the first, not just industrial country, but also really the preeminent imperial power at this time as well. The British are sending manufactured goods, and I'm mostly talking about cotton textiles, to India and selling them there. In fact, they are putting great pressure on the native Indian weavers and spinners. This is why later Gandhi will advocate for the Indians spinning and weaving their own clothes. And in India, they are getting bullion. They're finding gold. They're finding silver. They're finding jewels. They are getting maybe some fancier Indian textiles from India, and they are selling those things to China. But really the number one product that they start to sell to China, which is the most dangerous and most egregious violation of Chinese rights and so on, is opium. They're growing opium. Opium is grown from poppies and then prepared, and it is a drug that makes you it makes you lethargic, basically. Slows you way down. And then from China, of course, they're getting silk, which they're really crazy for, and tea, which the British are super, super crazy for. I really like the idea of tea because the way that the British drink tea, does anybody know how the British drink tea? Yes, with a lot of sugar and with quite a bit of milk. And so you get sort of this, you get a calorie boost with the sugar. You get a wakefulness boost, an energy boost from the caffeine. It's really good for factory workers to keep them going. So it's really quite important when the Brits get crazy. So that's what we have going on. Like I said, this is really kind of a terrible thing for the Chinese over time, and they realize that. The Chinese don't like that the British are increasing exports of opium to China over time. You can see that in 1729, fairly early, the British were exporting about 200 chests of opium. I don't know how big these chests are, but just, imagine a kind of wooden chest, a big wooden crate filled with opium. It is a wonderful product because it gets you hooked. And then you want more and more and more. And so the demand for opium and the export of opium increases year after year after year, all the way up until the 1830s. By 1838, it was about 40,000 chests of opium being exported to China. Now, all of this is illegal. The Chinese have laws against opium, and generally what British exporters are doing is paying off people, bribing local officials to look the other way so they can sell their 40,000 chests of opium. Somewhere 10 to 12 million Chinese people are addicted to opium by this point in time, and you can imagine if it makes you completely lethargic and completely useless, it's really something that the Chinese government wants to change. It's destroying their society. And so in the 1830s, they start to get serious about punishing people who are looking the other way, punishing the officials who are getting bribed, stopping the importation of opium, destroying the opium that they find, and British, I'm going to call them what they are, smugglers.
Well, I was just going to ask quickly, is opium, was it legal in the UK at that time? Or?
So I don't think there's enough of it to harm people. It's not something that they are bringing in huge numbers. It is legal, and they are sometimes preparing a mixture of alcohol and opium together that is a cure-all for a lot of things. You name the problem, and opium and alcohol together will cure it, or at least make you not notice it anymore. So whatever your problem is, there's that. A number of the romantic poets and writers get hooked on opium, which probably doesn't surprise you. But in general, it's not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who are hooked on it. It just isn't brought over in big enough numbers to affect things. But that's a great question. So when the British smugglers have their opium destroyed by the Chinese, they complain to the government, and the British government then steps in to protect their property and their liberty, and decide to go to war with the Chinese government. That is the first Opium War. And there will be several more opium wars from this period of time going on, as the Chinese have to fight European state after European state. And each time the Chinese are defeated, this has a lot to do with technology, and then every single time the Chinese are forced to continue taking the opium. This is a nice image of, you can see in the background, what do you see in the background?
British ships.
Yeah, so you can see in the background British ships, and you might even be able to see if I'm looking correctly. I thought maybe they might be steamships in addition to sailing ships. I think that's the case. You've got these British ships that are also steamships, kind of like paddle ships, and then they have cannon, they have guns that the Chinese junks or these Chinese ships don't have, and they're able to blast them out of the water and fairly easily win on the water, but then also on the land with better technology. The Treaty of Nanking is the first treaty of this first Opium War that extorts or forces the Chinese to not just take opium, but also to take British products without any kind of tariff or tolls being able to be levied upon them. So they're basically sort of forcing free trade upon the Chinese. Another thing that the British get, which really I think is indicative of their attitude, and we can talk about this in just a second, but they get this thing called, a right called extraterritoriality. It's a mouthful to say. What that means is if a British person, or eventually a European person, gets in trouble with the law in China, they get turned over to their own people for prosecution. So a British person who murders a Chinese person doesn't get tried in a Chinese court because, quote unquote, it might not be fair, or it's not a real court. They get turned over to Britain, and then the British are supposed to try them. Do you think that's fair?
No.
Yeah. Do you think that justice is served in that measure? And so, that sounds like a horrible thing. It's not all that uncommon, really, if you think about it. Even relatively recently, well, here's just an example of that. If an American soldier goes bonkers in Afghanistan and kills a bunch of people in Afghanistan, where does that American soldier go on trial? Yeah, in America. So there's sort of this lingering extraterritoriality, and then you might say, well, that kind of makes sense because it's really a somewhat similar thing. So Britain is getting the trade, Britain is getting to send the opium, and Britain is getting this extraterritoriality, and then, like I say, nation by nation by nation comes along, fights a war with the Chinese, and then it gets those same kinds of things. China starts to be divided up into spheres of influence. these aren't absolute control areas of control by the Europeans, like you'll see in Africa or like you saw in Central and South America. It's basically, there is still a Chinese government. There is still a Chinese emperor or empress. They've got a bureaucracy. They have a military. But at the same time, the Europeans are there, and there's really nothing that China can do about that. And it's just the situation. Then these European states start to invest their capital. They start to build railroads. They start to create entire cities that look very European, actually. And the Chinese just have to kind of put up with it. They don't like it very much, as you can imagine. The Chinese have always felt themselves to be superior to everyone else, and now the barbarians are actually, running their state for them. They don't really like that at all. There's kind of the way it looks. You've got different areas that are controlled by various European states. Oftentimes, if you have, a territory that's close to something else that Britain controls, like India, then that's going to be their territory, or the part that is controlled by the French, in French Indochina, controlled by the French. I particularly, you know me by now, I really like the part that's controlled by the Germans, which seems really bizarre, but this still exists today, this place called Tsingtao. And the old part of Tsingtao looks like a German town from that period of time, from like 1900. They have a brewery there, and the Bismarck barracks are still there. It's very strange. But that's what we have going on. And there's oftentimes these cartoons, these images of China being carved up by the Europeans and the Chinese not really being able to do anything about it. You see that we don't have any territory in China, we Americans. We got in a little bit too late, and we're kind of angry about that, and tried to get everybody else to allow us to sell things everywhere with an open door policy that didn't completely work for us. The Chinese nationalists get angry about being controlled by foreigners, by these foreign devils. In fact, there are two groups that these Chinese nationalists are against. The name of the Chinese nationalist group is the Society of Harmonious Fists. They are martial artists. Somebody's got to do a movie about this that everybody would watch, because I think it would be maybe they don't want to see that. Anyway, the Society of Harmonious Fists, or what the Europeans and Americans call the Boxers, rebel against the foreign influence in two ways. The actual foreigners who are there, they try to kill, but they also go against Chinese Christians. And there are millions of them, a few million Chinese Christians. The Boxers, as nationalists, hate the Chinese Christians because they feel like they've adopted a foreign system of belief and are disrupting Chinese society. So they try to kill both groups. The Europeans, who are generally at this point in time kind of fighting with each other, are able to come together because they're fighting against a common outside enemy, and they put together an international force of about 20,000 troops to march on Peking or Beijing, the capital, and put down the Boxer Rebellion. Japan is also a very interesting story because it is so different than what you expect, or so different from what happened to people in Africa, and so different to what happened to people in China. To make a long and interesting story pretty darn short, for a long period of time, the Japanese just were isolated from everybody else. In the 1600s, they just turned their backs on the rest of the world and said, we want to have no contact with anyone. You leave us alone. And for a few hundred years, they just lived like that. They lived having a kind of feudal society with samurai and an emperor and shoguns and people dressed really in the same ways that they were in 1600, dressed the same way in 1850. things just didn't really progress for the Japanese. In 1853, like I say, a long story short, the United States said, it sure is a shame that Japan is not participating in the world market. It sure is a shame that they're not buying our stuff or that we can't buy their stuff. And so we sent a fleet of steam-powered warships into Tokyo Bay and said, hey, Japan, guess what? You're going to open up or we'll blast you. And they said, oh, okay, I guess we're going to open up. And they did. And here's where the story gets really pretty interesting. The Japanese looked at what happened to the Chinese and said, well, we don't want that. We need to westernize. We need to modernize as quickly as possible. And so there was this Meiji Restoration that starts in 1867. And within a couple of decades, really 20 years, 30 years, feudal Japan, 1600s Japan, becomes like any other European state of 1900. The emperor was restored to power, industrialization begins, the old hierarchical classes were abolished, a national conscription of soldiers begins. They want to create a modern-style military, a modern economy, a modern system of government, a modern system of education. They go all around the world, and they steal the best elements of Europe and America and adopt them for their own country. And boom, are able to enjoy new imperialism like everybody else who is white is enjoying new imperialism. It's absolutely amazing. I don't think you can find another example like this throughout world history, the way the Japanese jump headfirst into 1900. Do you have any questions or comments about that?
Are we going to learn about, oh well, that's not a lot. Anyway, World War II history of Japan?
Ever so slightly. I will describe the Japanese as the Nazis of Asia.
Yay.
It's really fascinating the way that they have very similar attitudes and they have a very similar political and social and racial philosophy. So just to prove my point, there is a Sino-Japanese war, Sino being China, Chinese-Japanese war in 1894-95, Japanese win. There is a Russo-Japanese war in 1904-1905, the Japanese win. They annex Korea in 1910 as well. And then the European states look at Japan really quite differently than they look at most other non-white people around the world. They almost accept them as an equal. The Russians are completely shocked when they lose to the Japanese in 1904, 1905. And in fact, Europeans and Americans are kind of shocked, but then they say, in the typical way, well, they are Russians. They're Slavic people. They're down here. They're like number 6 on the white people scale. They're kind of at the bottom with the Italians. And the Japanese, boy, their racial stock goes way up. Let's put those Japanese right up there somewhere, because they're doing really, really well. All right, I got to move along here. In terms of the rest of Asia, I think the French are taking over, like I said before. The French are taking over Indochina. That becomes important because it's Vietnam, and they'll fight a Vietnam War before we take that over for them. Thailand, or what we used to call Siam, is kind of a buffer between the British part of Asia and the French part of Asia. The Russians are sort of creeping on the Chinese in Manchuria. The United States flexing its muscle for the first time, 1890s, has a war against Spain? Do you remember when we used to talk about Spain back in the day? Spain is still around, and the United States can beat up on them pretty badly in a Spanish-American war. And take over the Philippines, and take over Cuba, and take over places in the Caribbean. Another thing that's still there is the Dutch are holding on to the Spice Islands. You might remember when the Dutch made a lot of money off of spices. They still hold on to Indonesia, but there's something much more valuable then and now in Indonesia that the Dutch were making money off of. It's the there's two things actually, second industrial revolution. Do you know what those two things might be? The raw materials from Indonesia, from all of these islands?
Rubber?
Yeah, rubber and orangutans. No. Oil. Yeah. And then also palm oil, but, that's maybe not as important as the kind of oil you put in a combustion engine. Arguably. All right, let's buzz through Africa really quickly if we can. There is a Suez Canal that's built in 1869 by a French company. Half of the shares then of this corporation belong to the French and half belong to the Khedive of Egypt, or the ruler of Egypt. Oftentimes, people in other parts of the world borrow money or get in trouble financially with European states, and European states take them over to ensure that they're going to get paid back. This is more or less what happens in Egypt. The Khedive of Egypt is trying to borrow money to improve his state, to make himself more powerful. He's part of the Ottoman Empire for a long period of time, actually. And Britain and France then force financial sensibility or financial, I can't think of the word, but forcing them to pay their debts, essentially, and live within their means by taking over tax collection, and eventually the British buy the shares of the Suez Canal from the Khedive of Egypt, and then eventually take over Egypt, more or less, in kind of an indirect way. There are some interesting nationalist rebellions that happen around this period of time against the British. There is a Mahdist revolt or Mahdist war that happens in just south of Egypt in Sudan. They are fighting against the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are unable to crush them, and so the British kind of step in and crush this revolt of, I suppose, if we use today's terms, they would be called Islamic extremists. But they're also nationalists who want to chase away, foreign influence. I don't know. Is there much of a difference? There's some famous setbacks of European people at this point in time, but in general, the Europeans are able to crush rebellions, crush revolts wherever they rise up, and oftentimes with extreme brutality. In the 1880s, only about 10% of Africa is controlled by Europeans. It's just a very sliver of this huge territory. And then kind of an unlikely thing happens. The King of Belgium, Leopold II, he says he wants to improve the lives of African people. He wants to end slavery that's going on from African to African. That's still, still part and parcel of what the Africans have going on. And so he sends some people, some representatives, personally, not from Belgium, but from King Leopold, to go to the Congo, kind of the center of Africa, and try to get local chieftains to sign documents that give him the ability to kind of regulate their affairs. Really, what he says he's trying to do is both stop slavery and then also make a profit. Well, the Europeans aren't really sure if this is allowed. Can you do this kind of thing? Can you just plant your flag somewhere in Africa and say that this is your territory? What What if other countries want to take over the Congo or any other place? And so Bismarck, who runs European diplomacy at this point in time, decides to call together everybody to a conference in Berlin, and they discuss what Leopold had done, and they think that that's probably okay. And then they said, well, this is, if it's okay for Leopold to do, it's okay for the rest of us to do. Let's kind of set some rules for this game and kind of go from there. So the rules of the game are really pretty loose. You just have to send some people to a place and do something there. Economically develop in some way. But once again, it's kind of this idea of white man's burden. That these Europeans are going to send some folks to these places, set up an occupation, and then, teach them to wear socks, or maybe teach them to grow products that the Europeans want or need, or somehow keep them busy, force them to work. Well, once that happens, then it's kind of a free-for-all with people, with different nations, sending people and troops and explorers and bureaucrats and so on to divide up the country. It becomes a scramble. It becomes a real race. You might remember that already way back with Charles X, I keep mentioning him, France took Algeria, then Britain takes Egypt, Leopold takes the Congo. Once that Berlin conference happens, then it's just a land grab. It kind of ends then, early 1900s, with Britain finishing off South Africa, taking it over, and kind of co-opting the people who had lived there before to work together with them to control everybody else who lived in that place. That story is also interesting because it isn't maybe like what you expect. And so this is kind of related to our video clip that we'll watch here in just a second. Go way back to the 1600s when the Dutch were having a golden age, and the Dutch are sending ships all over the world, and the Dutch are need a place to stop between their Spice Islands in Europe, and it's the southern part of Africa. They send some settlers there. Those settlers start to, very much like what's going on in the American colonies at that point in time. You can kind of like picture the same sorts of people. They've got guns and they're farmers, and they're pushing the natives out, or they're enslaving the natives to some extent. A couple hundred years go by, and British people start to show up. 1815, the British are also landing ships and sending people. Well, by the way, what happens in 1815? What's the big deal with 1815?
Congress.
Yeah. So it's the end of Napoleon trying to control Europe, and the British then, I think, from 1815 on, the British really start to flex their muscle. That's part of this. Well, the British show up. The British have this idea, starting around this period of time, or continuing in this period of time, that slavery is wrong and bad. And they start to tell these Dutch settlers, these Dutch Boers, that slavery is wrong and bad. And the Dutch Boers don't want to hear it. They decide that they want to move away from these newcomers and move deeper into South Africa so they can continue to live freely and have slavery. They form a couple of independent states. One of them is called the Orange Free State. You know why orange?
For the Netherlands.
Yep, for the Netherlands, the William of Orange, the Orange family. And then also this other place called the Transvaal. So, independent republics, they don't really have anything to do with the Dutch or with the Netherlands anymore. Today's video clip, as I said, is Britain defeating this group of native Africans called the Zulus. The Boers fought the Zulus as well and defeated them in order to move into their territory. The British show up. The British defeat the Zulus as well. This is where your friend Cecil Rhodes comes in. Cecil Rhodes is trying to make a lot of money out of Africa, and he does that. Creates as you might have read yesterday, a diamond consortium, or diamond monopoly, called the De Beers Company. And as he's making a lot of money, he finds it frustrating that the Boers are sitting on territory where diamonds and gold has been discovered. He tries to overthrow the Dutch Boer settlers with this thing called the Jameson Raid. Essentially hires a group of mercenaries to march into these Boer-controlled areas, overthrow the government, and open it up for exploitation. The Boers are not to be tangled with. They've lived in Africa for hundreds of years. They're very tough. They're great riders. They're great hunters. They're great sharpshooters. And when Jameson and his men show up to try to overthrow them, they're more or less arrested, taken into captivity, and this raid or this attempt to overthrow the government fails. That frustrates Britain. It frustrates Cecil Rhodes at this point in time. Well, increasing tensions between not just Cecil Rhodes and these Boers, but Britain and these Boers over the resources that the Boers are sitting on, and the lack of Britain's ability to just do whatever they want there leads eventually to a couple of different Boer wars. The second one is more of a big deal in the world than the first one is. The British have a heck of a time defeating the Boers. And in the end, they resort to, here's what's happening. The Boer men on horseback are kind of doing all these hit-and-run raids against the British, and then riding off into the countryside, being supported by the farms that they left behind. They've got their women and children back throughout much of South Africa, so they're being sustained by these women and children and old people who are hanging on to these farms. The British decide to take away the Boer fighters' ability to go and hang out and get resupplied by these farms. They concentrate the population of the Boers into camps. I guess you could call them, what's the word for that? Concentration camps for white people, which really throws it throws the people of Europe into kind of a tizzy. They don't mind so much when you're doing this to Asian people or to African people, but white people versus white people really kind of gets them going. Britain wins this war and eventually frees these people from their concentration camps. And in the end, in order to get the Boers and the English people sort of on the same side once again, they decide to share power with the Boers. And the Boers say, wait a second, we'll share power with you, that'd be fine, but we want to be racist. And the English say, we want to be racist too. So we're on the same page. So South Africa starts to get created in a continuing, let's say, racist state. That'll take a really long time to divest itself from racism. There's the tough Boer guys that the British had a heck of a time overcoming. And then we don't need all this stuff about Cecil Rhodes. You read about him. You know his opinions. There's a quote that just sort of sums it all up. It's somewhat difficult to believe how blatant his beliefs are, or people at that period of time, how blatant their beliefs are. I want to end today by just talking about a couple of places that were independent. There are two. Bobby, I think, reminded us of Liberia, which is it's established as a place for returning slaves or people who were slaves who were freed. They have this idea that maybe black Americans who were freed from slavery will go back to Africa, and they create this place called Liberia, like Freedom Land, in order for that to happen. So when the Europeans are dividing up all of Africa, they don't want to mess with this place that has connections to the United States. And then the second one is really kind of interesting too. There's a next chapter of that when we talk about the 20th century. But there's this place called Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is, it's a place that has an emperor. It has a military. The military purchases rifles of the kind that the Europeans are using from Russia, of all places. And when the Italians try to invade to take it over, the Ethiopians are able to fight them off. It's not really about the soldiers themselves, it's really about technology. And when whoever it is, wherever, has the same technology, then it's usually kind of a draw. And so, once again, the Italians are defeated by the Ethiopians, and people in Europe say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that, people of color were able to defeat white people. But then what do they say about the Italians? Well, it's the Italians down here. They're just below the Russians, or just above the Russians. Imperial tensions happen. There is and this has to do with Germany. We'll talk a lot about the stupidity of the Kaiser, or the German emperor at this point in time. Kaiser Wilhelm II is always shooting his mouth off and always trying to get, people to recognize that Germany is this great, great state. In 1896, when that Jameson raid was defeated, the Germans sent a telegram to the leader of the Boers, a guy by the name of Paul Kruger. And the telegram says, congratulations on defeating this raid, trying to topple you. The Germans have your back if you want the Germans' support. Completely needless telegram. It just aggravates the British. The Germans kind of get into this habit of aggravating people at this period of time. 1898, you have British explorers and French explorers kind of coming together at a place called Fashoda, kind of near the Sudan. They're each marching across Africa, mapping it and claiming it for themselves. Boom, they come together in 1898. Maybe there's going to be a war between France and Britain over Africa. Nope, the French back down and Britain keeps on marching. The Germans threaten the French over Morocco a couple of different times. Once again, the emperor shoots off his mouth a couple of times. He sends gunboats to Morocco, tells the Moroccan people they should free themselves from the French. Needless aggravation of the French. The Russians and the Japanese go to war. As you know, the Russians lose that. And then there's also an Anglo-Russian conflict over Afghanistan late in the 19th century. Britain wins that. Britain gets to have troops in Afghanistan, but then realizes that it's kind of hopeless to have troops in Afghanistan. That the people of Afghanistan do not like that and will fight against invaders. And the British have some fairly serious defeats. Russia will have their defeats in Afghanistan in the 1980s. I think I want to stop right there, and I want to show you this clip from the movie Zulu. Oddly, perhaps, or maybe not oddly, in the 1960s, as this period of decolonization is happening, as all these European states are pulling out of Asia, pulling out of Africa, giving the people their freedom, allowing nationalists to do their thing. In the 1960s, movies started to be made that glorified the earlier period of colonization. So I don't know if that's people who sort of like are sad that their empire is going away or what, but one of the classic movies is this movie Zulu. Let's see if I can find it here. Yep, you guys still should be able to see this. And this is about the British fighting the Zulu people, like I said, 1879 or so. The British have those breech-loading rifles, and the Zulus have spears. And the Zulus are trying to get rid of the British, of course, as nationalists, and the British are trying to be imperialists and keep control over them. In just a few years, the Maxim machine gun will be developed, which would make this fight much more of a slaughter. But as you'll see, this is pretty much a slaughter anyway. Those are actual Zulu people who were hired as extras for the film, so that's kind of cool. And I really like their style. They have well, you'll see.
You think the words can't be better than that, Alan? Well, they've got a very good bass section, mind. No top tenors, that's for sure. Stop your dreaming, can't you see their spear points gleaming? See their warrior pennants streaming to this battlefield. Sing! Steady, steady, come on, sing! Ever steady. Oh, the battle is raging, never yield. The mighty foes surrounding,
can see how incredibly destructive these weapons have, these weapons are that the Europeans have, and how, in some ways, defenseless the native people are. You get a lot of these kinds of rebellions against the Europeans who are trying to control people, but generally they're not very successful. And sometimes they're really pretty terrible, the atrocities that, for example, this won't surprise you, that the Germans are committing against the people that they're controlling, or the French, or the British. Anytime that somebody rises up against them, they feel really quite annoyed and vexed by that, because they feel like, you know, they're there to help people, and yet the people who are being controlled by them don't want that and are fighting back. So kind of like, you know, biting the hand that feeds them is the attitude. But for the flip side of that, for the Zulu people, they just want these invaders to leave and not be there, whether they be Boers or whatever people. Do you have any questions or comments in the last few seconds? Okay.